Good morning. So glad that you're here for the kickoff session in our virtual symposium today on protecting democracy, foreign interference, voter confidence, and defensive strategies in the 2020 election and beyond. I'm Carrie Cordero of the Center for New American Security. We have two sessions this morning. This session will run until 10:45 a.m. Eastern. And then I hope you'll join us again at 11:30 a.m. Eastern for a session that I'll be moderating on foreign influence and voter attitudes. Today's conversations are part of a broader collaboration between the Center for New American Security, the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law, which is a part of Penn Law, and the Annenberg Public Policy Center, also of the University of Pennsylvania. Before I hand it over to the moderator, this discussion is being live streamed, and you can post your comments and questions on Twitter using the hashtag #ProtectDemocracy2020. Our team will be monitoring the hashtag and will share your questions with our moderator. Foreign influence in our civic life was top of mind for the country's founders. America may have been caught off guard in 2016, but there's no reason for falling for the same tricks again twice. We need to understand the influences around us, take collective steps to counter them, and work to strengthen our democracy. Our CNAS, CERL, and APPC collaboration is our effort to do just that. I'm now going to turn the mic over to the extraordinary Professor Claire Finkelstein, my friend and faculty director of the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law at the University of Pennsylvania's Carey Law School, who is a leading voice on the intersection of law, ethics, and national security. Over to Claire, who's going to introduce our guests for this session.
Thank you so much, Carrie, and it's a pleasure to have this collaboration with CNAS and with APPC. There is no more important topic today than election security as we approach the 2020 general election and look back at what has happened in the last 4 years and contemplate the lessons from the 2016 and the 2018 elections. It is critical that different stakeholders, experts, academics, practitioners come together to think hard about the security of our democracy and about where we need to be moving forward as we approach the election and beyond. I am delighted today to have two of the greatest experts on this topic and friends and colleagues as well. Kathleen Hall Jamieson, who is the director of the Annenberg Public Policy and the author of a very important book called Cyber War that dealt with the 2016 election. Delighted to have Kathleen here. And Director James Clapper, who was the director of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence from 2001 to 2006. I am also pleased to say that he is an executive board member of the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law, of which I am the faculty director. I'd like to jump right into our conversation, and I'm going to moderate a conversation with Director Clapper and Professor Kathleen Hall Jamieson in an informal conversational manner, inviting them to jump in at any point, and then we will field your questions. I'm going to raise a few topics for discussion, and in the first instance, let me just pitch this to Jim Clapper. Jim, the general review of what we know about the 2016 election and the dangers that led up to it is something that you have spoken about consistently, written about, discussed widely. But just give us a sense as we approach the topic of election security in 2020, what are the lessons that we need to have learned from the 2016 election, and what should we be looking at in particular drawing from those lessons for the upcoming general election?
Well, thanks, Claire, and thanks to you and CNAS and others for hosting this very timely session on election security. With respect to 2016, I think start with a premise that the Russians have a long history, Russians and Soviets before them, long history of interfering in elections, theirs and other people's. And the expectation, I think, was, of course, we expected sort of the ambient level, some reconnoitering, if you will, reconnaissance, as well as perhaps active intervention. Russians have a long history of that in our country, going back to the 50s and 60s in the Cold War era, normally pretty ham-handed and not all that difficult to detect. 2016, though, was, they took it to a new level. And of course, they capitalized on the technology, and notably social media. So they had we never experienced the depth, scope, and aggressiveness of an attack on our fundamental system as we did in 2016. Multi-pronged, which included a very sophisticated propaganda campaign on RT and Sputnik, the two principal networks, funded by the Russian government. In addition to, of course, the hacking, well known about that, and the timely dumping of emails. But to me, the most disturbing thing, which I think we're most ill prepared for, was the social media assault. Mueller report, volume 1, cites the fact that the Russians reached 132 million Americans, I think that was the number, on Facebook alone. And the Russians exploited our polarization and divisiveness, and to a fairly well. They had messages for everybody, Black Lives Matter, white supremacists, whatever aggrieved group there was, they exploited their grievances and helped, I believe, to suppress, in certain cases, voting. Bearing in mind the election was settled on less than 80,000 votes in 3 key states, which the Russians targeted. So, looking back, I wish we had been more aggressive about publicizing this. There were contemporaneously reasons for not doing that initially, harbored by President Obama at the time. That was quite reasonable. For one, we're concerned about magnifying or amplifying what the Russians were doing. And I think the bigger point for President Obama was he was very concerned about the perception, the optic of his putting the hand on the scale in favor of one candidate at the disfavor of the other, against the backdrop of the accusations already being made by the candidate Trump that the election would be rigged. Of course, now others have gone to school on what the Russians did, so we have the Chinese and the Iranians involved. But the primary threat to me continues to be the Russians. The Chinese and the Iranians, I think, have other motivations. And what concerns me is the problem of the Russians who will have gone to school on the revelations that have been made public about their activities in 2016. And they're going to make every effort they can to hide their tracks. And so they are at it again, I'm convinced, but it's going to be harder to detect. So I'll stop there.
Well, so let me just invite Kathleen then in to say, in your book, Cyber War, you try to analyze whether or not the social media campaign could actually have thrown the 2016 election. Jim has just suggested that since the margin of victory was quite narrow, that may be the case. Do you agree with that? And can you talk a little bit about whether or not, in fact, you think it did?
I don't think the social media campaign did. What I knew in the first edition was that their theory of the election was sound. That is, they were engaging in activities consistent with the Trump campaign's needs. They were trying to mobilize constituencies that he needed to mobilize, white evangelical Catholics, for example, veterans and military households. They were trying to demobilize people he needed to demobilize, Black Americans. And they were trying to shift votes where they could to third-party candidate Jill Stein. So we knew that from the early evidence available. By the time the second edition came out, however, we had a complete block of all of the Twitter content, although Facebook was much less revelatory. But what we could tell from that and from the additional materials that have been disclosed by the platforms between the first edition and second edition, the second edition just came out in June, we were able to analyze the extensive content that was there, that very large multi-million number, most of which is not direct electoral content. And so if you look at the amount of exposure that they had, they would have to have reached high levels of susceptible individuals in large numbers to have created a decisive impact just out of the social media content. They didn't have enough reach and they didn't have enough electorally directed content in social media to do that. They probably created some effect on the margin. However, their hacked release content was demonstrably effective, and that's where we can document a clear effect in the American electoral system, because they changed the media agenda discernibly across time. And that change in media agenda was across time far more visible to the American electorate overall than anything in the troll channel and social media. As we know, when you set a media agenda in a direction that disadvantages one candidate because you create a message imbalance against that candidate, you increase the likelihood on the margin that influenceable voters are changed. 2016 was unusual in that a high number of influenceable voters. Usually the electorate's pretty locked in by the conventions. It wasn't in 2016. We had a high percent of independents. We also had a high percent of people who didn't like either candidate. And coming into the period in which the hacked content was most visible, we had a high level of early voting. And as a result, the likelihood the Russian influence was through the hacked content that was released through WikiLeaks is much higher than a social media influence. And then finally, there may have been Russian disinformation that may have influenced Jim Comey's decision to make public the indictment of Hillary Clinton, although not charging, in summer, and to, in effect, make public the reopened Wiener laptop investigation. That reopened laptop investigation changed the media agenda again decisively against Hillary Clinton. The voting patterns in the last week turned against her decisively. That could have been a combination of a hacked media use in media of hacked content and of the Comey disclosure. If there's any role of Russian disinformation in that disclosure, then the case becomes far more decisive.
Kathleen, this represents a little bit of a shift, you're saying, between the first edition and the second edition of your book based on new information that you obtained?
Yeah, the first edition basically said we knew that the social media activity was based on a sound theory of the election. The content was persuasive. It was largely amplifying themes already in the American electorate. And there was enough to create a message imbalance. What the first edition didn't know was how many people were actually reached by electorally relevant content. We didn't have enough electorally relevant content once we saw all of what was there. We didn't see all of what was there at the point at which the first edition was out. We largely saw the advertised content, not the viral content. And it's relatively clear now, looking at everything we can know, and we can't know everything about it, but there simply wasn't enough that was electorally relevant, reaching enough people to have created a decisive impact, even in an election decided as closely as that was. The hacked content, on the other hand, had incredibly clear effect on the media agenda. Media agenda setting is powerful. It also created message imbalances against Clinton. That's powerful. We have evidence from our surveys that those people who were shifting their votes across time were shifting them consistent with the patterns of media change associated with the hacked content's release. And in the second and third debates, hacked content is used in ways that takes it out of context. That's a media problem, press problem, as much as a Russian intervention problem. But in the second and third debates, the perception that Hillary Clinton says one thing in public, another in private, both inferences drawn from hacked content as used by debate moderators in the debates. Those people who said that difference between those who watched the debate and didn't in the presence of control are less likely to vote for Hillary Clinton. That's a clear evidence of impact than anything we can say about the trolls.
Jim, let me go back to you and ask you about the hacking part of this. What did we know? When did we know what Kathleen is saying right now, how influential the hacked content was, and what could have been done about it?
Well, we didn't know nearly, and we had a month to put together our ICA, so we didn't have the level of detail that you just heard at the time. I wish we had, but we didn't. And some of this, frankly, came from the sort of innate, instinctive reluctance to monitor domestic social media. And so we didn't have quite the, the insight. I mean, we certainly knew about the hacking and all that, but I don't know that we were able to gauge in the short period of time we had what the impact was. And in my book, I assert which I published 2 years ago, that based on what I saw, that I felt sure that the Russians really made a difference in swinging the election towards Donald Trump and away from Hillary Clinton. And now you just heard some, very specific empirical evidence that makes that case. But we didn't have the detail or the specificity contemporaneously 4 years ago that looking back, that we know now. I would commend, for example, the first part of the Mueller report, which doesn't get a lot of attention, and the extensive technical detail that the decision was made to publish. Well, we were as intelligence people traditionally are, concerned about revelation sources and methods. Well, apparently, wiser heads prevailed in the Mueller report and went into extensive detail about the technical basis for and the evidentiary basis for extended Russian interference. So all these things, and this is a good thing, have come out since the assessment we did, which we put together in 1 month.
Jim, can I ask you?
Let me have one follow-up with you, Jim, and then I'll come back to you, Kathleen. The hacking that took place, there was supposedly hacking of the RNC, not just the DNC. But we never saw an email dump from the RNC. What exactly do you think the Russians thinking when they hacked the Hillary emails, the DNC, and then released them onto WikiLeaks, as far as we know? Well,
I don't know what they were thinking. I'm not a mind reader of the Russians, but I assume that they felt there was political hay to be made here, since they clearly, and this starts with Putin himself, had a very strong animus for both Clintons, and particularly with her, since he held her responsible for attempting to foment a color revolution against him in their election in 2011. So I guess they just made the strategic decision that whatever they can do that would in any way embarrass her and damage her candidacy, that they would do. But I can't tell you what they're actually thinking.
And the timing, I take it, and Kathleen, this is what you're saying, the timing was a big part of the impact with the media amplifying that content and helping to assure, ironically, that it had the impact that the Russians were seeking.
Yeah, and I would ask this question of Mr. Clapper. On October 7th, did the intelligence community mean to convey that the Russians were behind the hacking of the DNC only and not behind the Podesta hacking? Because what happened on October 7th was, with the Access Hollywood tape being released on that day, your intelligence report comes out, then you get the Access Hollywood tape, and on the same day, the Podesta hacked content is dumped. And a question from a journalistic standpoint is, were the journalists to understand from the intelligence briefing that morning that briefing encompassed the hacking of the Podesta content, or was it only focused on the earlier DNC hack?
It was only focused on the earlier hack.
And so a journalist would not necessarily have been able to say then that the Podesta Act hacked content was Russian in origin when it is used in the media cycle to counterbalance the Access Hollywood tape and that story.
Yeah, well, we didn't factor in all this stuff at the time. The Access Hollywood tape obviously caught us by surprise. It completely emasculated the message that we'd intended to convey. And of course, we had decided to do that, a week or two at least before it was actually released, because we did have to haggle over the language, again, protection sources, methods, and the nuance of how much we dimed out Putin personally and all those kind of things. and we had to run it through the interagency. So it just was a happenstance that we got all that done and publicly released that statement on the 7th of October. And of course, as I said, the message was completely emasculated by the Access Hollywood tape.
Well, and that's the first clear evidence of the Russians changing the media agenda, because had you had that announcement by the intelligence community and the Access Hollywood tape, the media agenda for that weekend, and remember the second debate is October 9th, 2 days later, would have been an anti-Trump media agenda, with the intelligence community potentially being examined on television, asking, how do you know? What do you know? But what about these Russians? For practical purposes in the media agenda, the intelligence community's report dropped below the front fold on the first page, dropped out of the media agenda on the Sunday news shows, and as a result was not being featured prominently by the media as it began to cover the rest of the hacked content dropped week by week throughout the rest of the election. But the first clear electoral effect of the Russians through Julian Assange is to create an equivalence media frame that day that results in the downplaying of the intelligence community report and creates a parallel between what does Donald Trump say in private and do in public, what does Hillary Clinton say in public, do in private, say in public, private. And so now instead of two pieces of news that would be potentially damaging to the Trump campaign, you have a counterbalancing of the hacked Podesta content being played against the Access Hollywood tape, and the intelligence community report is being largely ignored. Donald Trump potentially could have lost his place at the top of the ticket had you had only those two pieces of potentially problematic news for Trump and not the Podesta counterbalancing, which is why it's so important to know whether the reporters could reasonably surmise the Russians were behind the hacking of the Podesta content or not, and raises the question, when did the intelligence community know the Podesta content was Russian hacked, and how and when did it tell the press that?
To be precise, I do not recall specifically the date and time that we realized we're aware of the Podesta tapes, the Podesta hack. I just don't remember clearly the sequence there.
Yeah, because one of my critiques of the press coverage, and I think as we look to 2020, how would the press treat hacked content is as important as how would the social media platforms treat it. Not as important as protecting our electoral infrastructure, but nonetheless extremely important. And if the press could not know from the intelligence community that the Podesta content was Russian hacked, then you can't say to them, you should have been saying all through October and November, Russian hacked every time you covered Podesta content, because they wouldn't have known that yet. And the question for the press is, why weren't you saying to the intelligence community, well, was it Russian hacked?
Right, so let's go on to what we can anticipate in the next 50 days. We haven't seen that kind of hacking, dumping this time around, and maybe it's yet to come. But let's stick, since you've highlighted that, Kathleen, with the hacking side of things for the moment. Jim, what have we done from what you know, and obviously you're not in office anymore, but from public reports or from anything else that you know, what have we done to protect ourselves against this kind of hacking content in the run-up to the 2020 election?
Well, I think the first thing that's important is obviously there's a lot more awareness and sensitivity to the whole threat posed by the Russians. So I'm sure a lot has been done, particularly at the state and local level, to improve cybersecurity. That's all important. It's probably uneven. Some places, I'm sure, better than others. So I think there is the greater awareness of it. And if it were to occur, I would hope, I don't know, that there would be a more aggressive publicity about it. And I do think that there could easily be another such effort made by the Russians. I'm part of an effort called Cyberdome, which is a group of people that on a volunteer nonprofit basis are trying to help the campaigns and those affiliated with the campaigns to secure their networks. And I think there are a lot of efforts going on. If you listen to Chris Krebs from DHS, they feel confident that they're much better prepared, and I'm sure they are. But I can't gauge how effective that's going to be, nor can I foresee exactly what other things that we haven't thought of the Russians might do.
So one of the questions that Kathleen's discussion raises is, if such a hack and dump were to occur in the next 50 days, are we prepared to manage the fallout from that in a more effective way than we did the last time? And is the media prepared as a society, and in particular the media, is the media prepared to identify or at least be suspicious to a greater degree than they were in 2016 of such information coming out in order to potentially label it, as Kathleen says, hacked content.
When you say media, there are wide variances in the spectrum there. So I don't know the answer to your question, Claire, about how well the media is prepared or the public. I don't know. I'm frankly concerned about how the government reacts.
Right. So what's your thought about that, Jim? And then I'm going to turn back to Kathleen and ask her the same question.
Well, the appearance, at least, of sort of muzzling, or at least I think slanting the message a bit that we've received so far. Well, I can't say I have a high level of confidence about just how much of this would be shared with the media, or the American public, or anybody, even the Congress, for that matter.
Kathleen, do you think we're better prepared to deal with this kind of hack and dump this time around than we were in 2016?
I don't know. We know that there are attempts to hack right now. So the question is, are we going to see this happening sometime in the next weeks? The failure in 2016 is a failure of journalistic norm enforcement. In fairness to reporters, they had over 150,000 blocks of content being dropped, units of content being dropped on them. That's an awful lot to make sense of. But they failed to say they hadn't independently verified the content, which is a journalistic norm. You're supposed to say whether or not you've independently verified. They hadn't. They did not track it back to Julian Assange's WikiLeaks. They credited to WikiLeaks, and the process ignored the fact that Julian Assange has publicly opposed the candidacy of Hillary Clinton. So they had a self-interested source. And as a result, they did not look as they should have at the timing of the releases by Assange, which was highly strategic and which was designed to do maximum damage to the Democrats. And in the process, because I think of the speed of the moment and simply being overwhelmed, they also, I believe, inadvertently took key pieces of hacked content out of context. That occurred when Hillary Clinton's statement that she said sometimes you have to say one thing in public, another in private, was sundered from its context, which was a discussion of Steven Spielberg's film Lincoln. And it was a generalized statement that had nothing to do with her saying privately to banks, I'm actually not going to do in private what I'm saying I'm doing in public. She was saying no such thing. And the implication of the coverage was that she was saying such things. She was not. Secondly, the press took the open borders, open trade statement as if that's what she'd said, as if she said, I stand for open trade and open borders. She hadn't. In the hacked content, she'd said open trade and open borders sometime in the future in the Western Hemisphere, and in the same sentence referred specifically to energy. When the press reduced those two, she confessed in private that she says one thing, another in public, which she had not actually done, and translated that segment of open trade, open borders, sometime in the future, Western Hemisphere, and speaking specifically about energy transfer, into she said she stood for open trade, open borders. They create a substantial disadvantage to her in the second and third debate, with audiences of over 60 million to each. And that is why that debate finding, that debate viewers compared to non-viewers in the presence of controls think she's more likely to say one thing in public and another in private, is so damaging. And why it is so damaging to say that when you think that, you are less likely to vote for her in the presence of all of the other stimuli. So there's a strong indictment here of the press violating its own norms under the pressure of the moment, with an enormous amount of content to deal with in a highly polarized environment. Have they learned the lesson? We're not going to know until they are stress tested by having another instance. I hope we never, as a result, know the answer, because I hope we don't have another instance.
And Kathleen, you've said that in 2016, the social media campaign you now believe did not by itself throw the election, but is there potential in 2020 when the social media interference has, if anything, gotten more sophisticated, and as Jim mentioned earlier, other countries have gotten into the act? Do we think maybe the Russians have learned, the Russians in particular, have learned how to make their social media impact more effective?
Yeah, I think we ought to take Director Clapper's statement about don't fight the last war, and they're adapting very, very seriously. But what we can say is we're adapting too. The social media platforms have now put in place clear protections. They now make it far more difficult for a foreign national to buy advertising, for example, blatantly illegal in our system. And by the way, when some of those ads were purchased in rubles, that should have been a clue that something was going on in 2016. But now it's very, very difficult to do that. Now you need ID numbers, you need an internal US address. You could still in theory do that, but you're gonna have to work a lot harder at it. They now are shutting down accounts because they're looking for what they call inauthentic behavior. And we've seen them regularly shutting down those accounts since 2016. That's hopeful as well. And with the trafficking of material on YouTube, and where in the past, there was no identifying of a state actor behind YouTube postings. Now, when you see RT posting material, and RT has substantial amount of public visibility, you will also see on the bottom of the screen that RT is tied to the Russian government. So now we're just
now remember that's mandated.
That's
right.
mandated.
So
yes.
That's mandated because RT is registered under the Foreign Agent Registration Act.
No, it's not. This is because YouTube has decided that it wants to do that. It's doing that for all government-sponsored content. So it's doing that for PBS too. But it gives you one more cue. We know audiences judge messages through the source of the message. And in the past, with that absence of that sourcing, you could just think RT was one more media outlet. You wouldn't have known that you had a Russian government behind it. And if you see RT now in your cable systems, in your home, in your hotels, or you hear Sputnik on air, you don't actually have the same protection that we have with the YouTube posting of those videos. Those are all big changes, and they're important.
That's right. Jim, how do you see the social media side of the risks in the run-up to the 2020 election?
Well, as Kathleen indicated, there have been some demonstrable improvements, and they're now doing things that they didn't do in the run-up to the 2016 election, and so hopefully that those things will help. But also, I have to recognize that the volume of material that they need to screen and hopefully point out. So I don't do social media, so I can't gauge how effective that is. It's a monumental job, and I will tell you, given First Amendment considerations, I wouldn't want to be the one to have to write the rules on what to screen out. That's a very difficult problem, but it's certainly better than it was in the previous election.
Before we talk a little bit about what social media companies can do and the private sector can do in more detail, I'd like to talk about Election Day in particular, and talk about some of the risks from disinformation that could occur. Let me give you a scenario. So let's imagine that many people are voting in person who would otherwise have done mail-in ballots because they're concerned about what's going on with the post office. They're concerned about the reliability of mail-in ballots. And so they, despite fears of the pandemic, they flock to the polls. And then there is a social media meme that posts that says, puts out some disinformation. For example, there's an active shooter in such and such a polling location, or someone has been discovered to have active coronavirus infection, and that polling station is infected. Let's imagine this is Russian source disinformation. What can we do in the run-up to the election to guard against that effect? Could have a very powerful effect of dissuading people from voting.
Well, if you're asking me, I suppose this is a responsibility both of the government and the media. And given the decentralized nature of our voting system, this would have to be done on a local level. And that's where I think the rubber is going to meet the road on potential or contrived threats to the safety of the voting process. And just thinking about my own case where I live and what would have to be, what local election officials would have to do to be alert to such a situation, and then be able to verify or corroborate or not what has been postulated. That's going to be a difficult task, particularly if the Russians only do it a few places. That's manageable, but if it is widespread, I can't say how well we will collectively react to that. It could be quite daunting, and could have demonstrable impact on the outcome of the election.
And this really lies with the states, doesn't it? Because we're unlikely to see any kind of leadership from the federal government to protect against such disinformation, given the political climate, given what we know about this president. So the question is whether or not the states are up to the task of policing the disinformation and its impact on voter turnout. Kathleen, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, first, the concern here is not simply foreign interference. This is a concern of domestic actors as well. And it's more likely that you have something happening domestically amplified by foreign actors than that foreign actors would actually initiate, because you'd need a reasonable amount of local information to understand how to play that tactic out. This is the reason that it's so important that local news be trusted by its audiences. Because if we're told, for example, in Philadelphia, that there is a threat to the Mount Airy voting station, I would vote in Mount Airy in my neighborhood. I need to trust that local news will be there to verify, and that we have the vigilance as a community to have alerted local news to the fact that the social media stream is now saying that there is a threat. So fortunately, there is still high confidence in local news, but here's the worry that I have. We knew in 2016 that we have what I call sleeper accounts. That is, these were troll accounts that did not engage in any form of propaganda. They did not engage in electoral-related activity. They didn't even look as if they were trying to amass audiences in order to persuade them in one direction or another. They simply looked like local news accounts. They were laying low in order to activate at some point, the same way a sleeper agent would have, in order to plant disinformation. So to the extent that we have those kinds of accounts that have been masquerading as local news and they haven't been caught by the social media platforms because they're not giving the cues that might otherwise make them detectable, there's the possibility that those sites are trusted, and as a result, those sites are competing with our legitimate local news to try to correct misinformation. It is more important than ever now that our local news stations are in touch with every source of accurate information and every source of disinformation as we approach Election Day, and that we say to the electorate, trust your local news outlets that you know. Here are the ones you can trust. Anything you've got on social media right now that is a local news outlet, be suspicious. And here's the second problem. The Russians and other malign actors, including those in the United States, have created imposter news sites. Those are sites that are often called fake news, a label I would like to dispatch from everyone's vocabulary because it delegitimizes news. And I would like to replace with viral deception, VD, venereal disease. You don't want to catch it, transmit it, etc. But when somebody's appropriating the identity of news and pretending they are news by taking the form of a news site. So for example, abc.com.com was set up in 2016 to look like ABC. The danger is people think they're going to reputable local news, they're going to an imposter site, and they are deceived. So we also need local news to say anything that doesn't have exactly this logo on it, exactly this identity, and you don't see, in our case in Philadelphia, Jim Gardner from Channel 6. Come to us, Jim Gardner, Channel 6. Come to us, Channel 10. Come to the channels you know. Because the danger is you go for verification, you get a sleeper site, and as a result, you're deceived and you stay home and don't vote.
So, Jim, it sounds like what Kathleen is talking about, which is really a concerning scenario of imposter news sites helping to magnify disinformation or put out disinformation really would require intense coordination between local voting sites, local law enforcement, and media. Do we have anything in our intelligence community apparatus that would allow for that kind of coordination and outreach? And sort of what is the state of the IC right now in terms of its robustness on the federal level for assisting in these efforts?
I have no idea. I don't. The formal structure would be. I mean, I would look frankly to the FBI, which has through their 55 or 56 field offices, so they have probably the best network of local liaison with local officials, particularly law enforcement, of anyone. The Department of Homeland Security operates, I think, some 77, at least the number that was prevalent when I left the government in 17, fusion centers, which work with the FBI. So that I would hope, but I have no idea, that there's been some planning done and some scenario spinning on just what they would do. One other factor I would mention is, the effect of states being red or blue. And in a red state, well, how aggressive would a Republican governor be about publicizing Russian efforts on social media to disrupt the election versus blue states? So that's another factor, and I have no way of gauging that. I just know what's out there.
And we do know, of course, that the federal government supplied, in the wake of the 2016 election, funds to help shore up security. However, a number of states actually turned down those funds, particularly red states were not actually interested in beefing up security.
And there are bills languishing in the Senate right now to enhance election security. And of course, they're not going anywhere before the election. So for my part, I'm very concerned about, even in spite of the lessons we've learned since 16, just how well prepared we are given the very charged partisan environment of this election. And if the scenarios that you've suggested occur, just how well we'll react to them. And again, it's all basically local. And I think the point about the media being our national conscience is a good one. And hopefully the media will step up in these situations, because I think that's going to be our most important bulwark of defense.
Let me ask you briefly about the FBI in this regard. We have a president who has attacked the intelligence community relentlessly since 2016, and indeed is currently engaged through his attorney general in investigations, counter investigations of a number of members of the intelligence community. Do we think that that has, or let me ask you, to what degree has that really crippled the ability of the IC to respond to anything that comes up, and others who may assist? There was an impressive report out of the Senate Intelligence Committee, a bipartisan report that did identify a number of threats to our security and reviewed the 2016 election situation. Do you think that there is enough robustness between our congressional committees and our what remains of our IC to address any of this on the federal level?
Well, again, I don't know the inside baseball here, but it has to have a implicitly chilling effect on people at the individual level. I just read in the media today that apparently I've been subpoenaed by Senator Johnson's committee. And here we are 4 years later and less than 2 months away from the election. And so when people see that, or they see, as in the case of Dan Coates, who was telling truth to power, and as a result, was removed essentially as DNI. So people see that, and it's hard to gauge because it's kind of a subjective thing and boils down to what individual intelligence people think and do in a given situation, and it's very hard to forecast that.
Well, on that note, I'd like to get in some of the questions from our audience. So I have a document here that will present some of your questions. If you can please forward those questions, and I will be delighted to present them to our extraordinary speakers.
And Claire, while you do that, let me just mention that there's a real role for the academic community here to be vigilant as we begin our early voting and through Election Day to monitor all of the social media traffic that's relevant to their media market so that they can help flag disinformation to reputable local media outlets to disseminate widely the reasons that you should be able to trust them, but also the reasons that you should be wary of alternative streams of influence, particularly about your voting.
Now, I think I need to remind members of our audience how to send your questions in. You'll want to use Twitter, and there's a hashtag Protecting Democracy 2020. Please feel free to send your questions to that hashtag, and I will convey them to our speakers. And I think I have some questions coming in, but while I'm waiting for those to come in, I'm going to continue our conversation just a little bit. Let's talk briefly about voter suppression. One of the things that's changed dramatically since 2016 is that we, of course, have Donald Trump in the White House, who was running for re-election in 2016. The president of the United States was not himself running for re-election. So that means that the head of our executive branch has a vested interest in the outcome of the election. And in the run-up to this election, there has been a lot of activity on the part of the White House and various cabinet secretaries trying to support the re-election bid of Donald Trump. What can we expect to see with regard to things that the executive branch uniquely has the ability to influence? And one of the things that I'm thinking about is security on Election Day and the threat to actually send law enforcement to polls. Jim, have you given any thought to that and whether or not that would have a chilling effect? Now, as I understand it, that actually would not be legal, and that there would have to be some kind of threat to justify, as well as a request from local officials to bring federal officials in. However, the possibility of fake security threats and disinformation circulating in that regard could provide the excuse for federal agents, similar to what happened in Portland, to actually come to polling stations. Any thoughts about that?
Well, yeah, I've thought about it. When the threat was made about sending federal law enforcement to polling places, well, there's an awful lot of polling places in this country. So that for one, it'd be just a simple limitation, physical limitation, just not that many people to get sent to that many polling places. And I also think that in many cases that local officials would react quite negatively to that, and certainly would raise a stink, I think, particularly if they hadn't requested anything. But I think for minorities, particularly if federal police of some, a la Portland show up, that could have certainly an intimidating effect on voters. So, I hope it doesn't happen. Given the bent of the Department of Justice and particularly the Attorney General, I think I'd look for opportunities to do just that, though. And so that's another concern I have, is about potential federal intervention in what is essentially a locally conducted activity.
I'd like to raise a question in a different fashion. We are so polarized now, and we have so many instances in which some individual, legitimately or not, has attacked the integrity of agencies that in the past we would have trusted to give us accurate information. So there are questions now: can we trust the Food Drug Administration to tell us the truth about a vaccine? And the question, specifically in the context of 2016, was 2016 so polarized, Director Clapper, that when you were putting the statement out from the intelligence community, you were concerned that it wouldn't be believed because people would assume that you're simply operatives of the Obama administration?
That's very true. And I think your point about, government entities that have normally been trusted will not be. There could, I think, easily be suspicion about anything the government says, which is regrettable. And I don't think we had that situation as stark in 2016 as it is now, because if anything, the polarization has gotten worse.
And one of the things I remember.
Go ahead, Kathleen.
Yeah, I just want to say, when I was first writing the first edition of Cyber War, when we knew much less than we do now, it was unclear that the Russians were actually behind, because there were some people who were challenging the intelligence community statement. They were essentially saying, you can't trust them, they're just Obama operatives. And I remember talking to people of integrity, goodwill, who are smart people, who said, well, what you've got to factor in it, these are the same people who told us there were weapons of mass destruction. And so perhaps the problem is they're just not competent. Now we've got a second reason that you might doubt. And my logic went like this: if an agency made a mistake like weapons of mass destruction, it would be so much more careful this time than it ever would have been in the past, even though it might have been very careful in the past and inadvertently got it wrong, that I'm going to go with the idea that they're telling me the truth. So before we had the evidence, I was premising the book on the assumptions it was the Russians, in the absence of the confirmation from the Mueller documents beyond what had been spoken by the intelligence agency. But what it speaks to is people within the academic community having had sufficient doubts raised about the integrity of these processes to say, who do you trust? Now we ask the question, now in 2020, if someone were to say the Russians are doing X, would we even believe that they are? And should the news media say that they are? And once we no longer can trust people to tell us what they know when they have specialized knowledge, our whole system breaks down.
I would just add that that's one reason why I was personally cautious and conservative, because I was around in, I think it was October of 2002, and my fingerprints are on the National Intelligence Estimate about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. I was then director of what was called NEMA, the National Imagery Mapping Agency, and I was present for the National Intelligence Council meeting that ended up approving that NIE, although it did have some very compelling dissents that got buried. Anyway, all to say, fast forward to 2015, 2016, it's one reason why I personally was very careful about what we said, and that and the confidence levels that we ascribed to the assertions that we made about Russian interference. And that was particularly the case with respect to the intelligence community assessment that we published in January 17.
Let me now ask some of the questions that the audience is asking. The first question that I want to ask is, how secure are American voting machines? Now, let me sort of rephrase this question a little bit, because some of them are strictly electronic balloting, and there's a big difference between electronic and paper ballots. And then, of course, there are the states with electronic balloting with paper backup. So this is a very technical subject. Jim, do you have any thoughts? Let me just say one more thing about it. In 2016, of course, there were reports about hacking into voter registration rolls, but we didn't have, at least even with further information, widespread reports of attempts to hack into to manipulate actual votes.
Yeah, actually, Claire, we made the statement that in the assessment that we saw no evidence of tampering with, voting machines or voter tallies. That's not to say it didn't happen. We just didn't see the evidence of it. And again, I think this time there'll be, heightened awareness of this. What I've read, and I can't verify this, but there's a very high percentage of voting processes where there is paper ballot backups. I would hope that would be a buttress against tampering, but it's certainly quite possible. One of the things that concerned us was we saw the Russians reconnoitering. Sometimes they were quite noisy about it, like they almost wanted us to know they were doing it. Voter registration rolls, for example, and of course there's all kinds of mischief that could be done manipulating them, but they never did anything with it. And the supposition was that, well, this is a sleeper thing, and that perhaps they were doing it to understand how to penetrate, and if they wanted to manipulate later. I don't know if that's the case or not. I do think, though, that there is a greater sense of awareness and heightened sensitivity about efforts on the part of the Russians, or for that matter, anybody else, to try to manipulate the voter tallies.
And Jim, is it a changed game in 2020 because of the connections, I'll just leave it that way, between foreign malign actors and those who have vested interest inside the United States, that level of coordination or potential coordination? Is that a game changer for 2020?
Well, it could be. I talked about this in my book about the striking parallels and similarities between things that the Russians were doing and saying, and the Trump campaign was doing and saying, particularly with respect to Hillary Clinton, and specifically her health. And there's striking parallels and similarities. I'm not suggesting the C word or anything, but so how much of that we'll see in 2020, I don't know, but we certainly shouldn't be shocked if we see similar parallels and similarities.
So now let me ask the next question. Are you aware of whether local media have set up any portals to receive and investigate election interference tips? The person who asked the question says, I'm aware of Meter Squint, but that sends tips to registrars, not media. Kathleen, maybe you want to answer this one?
I am not, but I would encourage everyone who has access to local media structures to do that.
Yeah, so what can they do specifically?
If I were running the major media outlet in any local news environment right now, we all know some stations are far more popular and some news outlets far more popular, I would open a tip line and I would publicize it. And I would say anything, it's the same way they open consumer helplines. So they have consumer helplines would say, if you think you've been defrauded, just contact this line and our investigative reporter will see whether or not, and then they put the piece on news that shows how they helped. I think they ought to consider this a consumer helpline, and it ought to be a voter helpline. and that we ought to be encouraging every local media outlet that has an audience to do it, and to set up a capacity around election day itself, because we're particularly worried about the physical voting on election day and how the effect of disinformation on it, because you don't have a second chance at that point. Once election day is passed, you're out of the game. To set up those kinds of structures that would let people raise concerns that they have read about, heard about, and then have regular on-air break-ins in order to engage in what we know from a scholarly standpoint is the best means of debunking. You can debunk in ways that legitimize a claim if you're not careful. So you don't want to set this up and magnify concerns that aren't actually there. So that's an argument for having local university communities that have done this research partner with local news communities to try to protect our local electorates.
Yes, and one of the things that we haven't talked about at all that could also be a help here is systems that have been set up in some states, it could be more widespread, to verify voting after the fact. And there is an organization called Verified Voting. We have at least one individual from that organization who will be speaking with us in our afternoon roundtables about how verification of voting could work. And one of the things, of course, that's worrisome is that there will be an initial readout of the election on November 3rd. Then there's going to be the tallies coming in from the mail-in and the absentee ballots that could affect that readout. If you then on top of it have verification procedures to verify the votes that have been cast, that could yet revise the tallies further. So this could be a very drawn out process in which, if it's a close election, we really won't know for quite a while. And if the initial sense is that one candidate or another has won, and then that changes, how that will play, whether or not people will be prepared to accept and have confidence in the announced results of the election.
We also need to think systematically going forward, because early voting is now going to become far more normal across all of our elections, about changing the patterns of reporting and having the states systematically think about when they start to tally the votes that they have and how they tally, because people, for the most part, are able, I believe, and I've been talking with law professors, I know I've got people there who know the actual answer, to revoke a vote once they've cast it. So one problem in tallying is, suppose I send in my vote and you're a state that allows you to say, no, I now want to cast another vote. How would you do that if you wanted to have early vote tallying? We need to think these things through so that we can protect the integrity of the ballot, but also protect the ability of the individual to, if they decide they want to change their mind based on some new revelations, to revoke that vote and cast the other vote by election day. And that's complex. It hasn't been systematically discussed. I worry we're going to have it decided on the fly.
Right. So let me get a couple other questions here just before we are out of time. Has misinformation related to the coronavirus pandemic created an even more hostile environment for election-related disinformation? That's a really important question. And one of the things, Kathleen, that I know you've been looking at is the spread of conspiracy theories. We've also been hearing about that with regard to our Attorney General recently, and the degree to which even members of the cabinet seem to subscribe to conspiracy theories.
Well, yes.
What about the link between coronavirus disinformation and election security?
Well, first, we know the Russians have been spreading conspiracy theories. So we've been focused on Russian disinformation about elections, but the Russians have spread disinformation about GMOs. They spread it about 5Gs. They spread it about vaccination. They spread it about coronavirus. They're engaged in any move that they can make that makes the United States look bad, and they always have, as Director Clapper began by pointing out in this seminar. And so the question becomes, in an environment in which you have conspiracy theories more active than they have been in some domains, and this is a health domain, but a conspiracy theory about health could affect the likelihood that you cast a ballot. How do those things synergize? We know that people who are more likely to believe the conspiracy theories are now more likely to not engage in protective behaviors. that they ought to be engaged in. So to the extent that you accept conspiracy theories, you're less likely to say you're going to take a flu vaccine. You're less likely to say you're willing to be contact traced. You're less likely to say that if a vaccine is proven, quote unquote, to be safe and effective by FDA standards, that you will take the vaccine. So we know that the conspiracy theories are able to affect projected behaviors. The question is, what would happen if you harness those conspiracy theories to a claim about the election that had something to do with COVID? Would that, in fact, be effective with those individuals? The worry is that the answer might be yes.
Right. Jim, do you have anything?
Claire, I'm sorry.
Yeah, just want to know if you wanted to add anything on that topic.
Yeah, I think it, that allows me to make a point I think is kind of important, and because just to make at least in my mind, a clear distinction between cybersecurity and the physical administrative security, if you will, of the voter apparatus and the means by which votes are cast, compiled, computed, and reported. And that's all very important. But to me, there is a second major bin here, category, which I would call, for lack of a better term, cognitive security. And this has to do with resisting what is promulgated on the internet, social media otherwise, and getting people to question what they see, read, hear on the internet. And I think we've done precious little preparation for improving our cognitive security. And it's very hard to do. It's very subjective. So, but I do think that at least for me, there are two distinct categories of concern that I have. One is sort of the cyber, administrative, physical security versus the more subjective cognitive or intellectual security of questioning conspiracies and other falsehoods that are spread on social media.
Yeah, and that concept of cognitive security is an incredibly important one. We may not have caught up to where we need to be in shoring up our cognitive security in advance of 2020, but I certainly hope it's something that we will be looking at in the future. Let me get one more question in here from our audience, which is, what, if any, is the impact of foreign election interference on elections for offices other than that of the president in 2020? Do foreign governments only care about the White House, or should we be looking at state and local elections as well, and sort of, how far down do they go? Jim, do you have any?
Well, I think in the Russians' mind, the most important one election is the one for president. That's the one they look at. I suppose they could, if they chose to, particularly perhaps for senatorial elections, won't involve themselves. But I think that in their mind, the most important thing is the president. That's why, we sort of pat ourselves on the back, I guess, on how well things went in the midterms in 2018. Well, I don't really think that was a real good index for the extent of Russian interference, because I don't think they were that interested.
Right. So that's an important lesson. We were sort of saying to ourselves, oh, look, we got through 2018, no major evidence. We must have improved. But as you point out, it may not be our improvement, but their lack of interest. Kathleen?
Yeah, the Russian hacked content did disclose a congressional level data that was used in at least one of the campaigns of 2016 at the congressional level.
That's helpful. Now, this morning, former DNI Dan Coates called for a bipartisan congressional commission to oversee the election and guarantee the integrity of the vote count. Do we think that would be a helpful measure, or do we, how reliable would that be? Should Congress get into the act? Would that be an effective thing for them to do?
Well, the thought I would offer is it's of course a good idea, but I'm not sure if there's time left to organize something of that magnitude and complexity this late in the process.
Yeah,
I mean,
Kathleen.
I would raise the question, in this polarized environment, do we have people who are considered nonpartisan enough and trusted enough by both sides to actually staff one? Do we actually have people like Governor Kane and Congressman Hamilton, who headed up the 9/11 Commission, where everyone said, yes, they are people whose judgment I will trust. They would never play games with any evidence. We are so polarized now, we may have made it impossible to put in place any structure that would not be challenged by someone for venal partisan ends.
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
I fear that is a changed game from 2016 even. The degree of polarization has become so extreme and the level of mistrust so high. Jim, you mentioned the fact that you had recently been subpoenaed, and I'm sorry to hear that. We know that there are various...
I knows what I read in the paper. I haven't actually heard anything officially about it.
Oh, God, that's interesting. We know that the Attorney General is working on a report through Durham that may come out, and there are several other attorney generals, as well as the 3 Senate committees that we talked about and FBI investigations. Should we be anticipating that some major report could drop between now and the election that would have a very similar impact to what the hacked emails had? Namely, you get the timing exactly right, you release that, and before people have a chance to really digest the reliability of what they have read, it throws the election.
Well, you know, I don't know. I assume that's certainly that's the president's objective, that there'd be some bombshell that would be dropped just before the election about actions that people took in 2016. But you know, I don't know. I guess the message I take away from this is what we were supposed to have done was to have ignored the Russian interference. Had we done that, everything had been hunky-dory. I guess that's the message here.
Of the counter investigations, yes. And there is a real concern. You might remember that Bill Barr, when he was recently testifying, was asked whether or not he would refrain from issuing any reports that might impact the election and the immediate run-up to the election, and asked specifically about the potential for an impactful Durham report. And he said, I do not promise that, so that he might very well be doing that. However, Durham himself has said that these investigations take a long time and he may not be done with the report in time for the election.
Yeah, again, that's all I know is what I read in the media. I don't know what to read into all that, and whether or not Durham will actually come out with something before the election. I don't know.
We are pretty much out of time. There will be a 45-minute break now. The next panel, which will be moderated by my colleague Carrie Cordero, will feature Robert Gates, who is Senior Fellow at CNAS, Scott Bates, Deputy Secretary of State of Connecticut, Vanita Gupta, President and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, Bill Crystal, the Director of Defending Democracy Together and Editor-at-Large of The Bulwark, Laura Rosenberger, Director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy and the German Marshall Fund. A very large panel on the next one. This has been a fabulous and fascinating conversation between the two of you. I should confess, having known both of you now for a little while, I have been very excited about getting both of you in a room together, as it were, even a virtual room for this conversation. Kathleen, you've done such extraordinary work. And Jim, of course, your service to the country and continuing engagement are so deeply appreciated. Thank you so much to both of you for having this conversation. We hope to all of our members of our audience that you will be back in 45 minutes for the next panel moderated by Carrie Cordero. Thank you so much, and thank you to my partners, our partners, CNAS and APPC, for this extraordinary conference today. that